Hi everyone, in this video we will be discussing the French Revolution. The text and objectives for this lesson are the following. We are going to compare the causes, characteristics, and consequences of the American and French Revolutions, and when we are finished with the lecture, you will have the opportunity to compare and contrast the French and American Revolutions using a Venn diagram handout. So let's first get started with the causes of the French Revolution. One of the main causes of the French Revolution is the estate system. The estate system is how French society was divided into different classes during the 18th century. So they're divided into three different classes known as estates. The first estate is made up of the clergy. This is the priests and the church officials from the Catholic Church. They only make up about 1% of the population. The second estate is the nobility. They make up about 2% of the population, and they are pretty much the aristocrats, the people who come from important families in France. The largest of the estates is the third estate. They include all of the city workers, the peasants, the farmers, the craftsmen. But a big part of that third estate is a growing middle class known as the bourgeoisie. They are very well educated and wealthy merchants, professionals, and shopkeepers. And because they are literate and they have money, they are attracted to Enlightenment ideas, and they are also more likely to question the government. This political cartoon shows how unpopular the estate system was in France. The guy in purple represents the church. You notice he has a cross around his neck. And this guy on the right represents the second estate, the nobility. And this man at the bottom represents the third estate, the poor, the peasants, the farmers. And the political cartoon is telling us that the third estate of France has the burden of supporting the first and second estate. All of this is made worse by the financial crisis that France experiences in the late 18th century. So there's a very unfair tax system in France where the first and second estate have to pay very little taxes, if any at all. They're pretty much exempt. There's also different tax rates for different regions of the empire, and so people don't really pay their fair share of taxes, and some people feel like they're shouldering all of the burden. There's a very high national debt that has been the result of long wars with Great Britain, including the 7 Years' War, including the French and Indian War in the colonies, and also helping in the American Revolution. And on top of that, the king and his family spend a lot of money on extravagant lifestyles. So that has plunged France into a great deal of debt. So this chart shows us how unfair and badly distributed the tax system is. So the first estate, like I mentioned, is only 1% of the population, and they're represented by this little black line here, and they own about 10% of the land, but they pay absolutely nothing in taxes. The second estate is about 2% of the population. They own about 25% of the land in France, but they only pay 2% of the taxes. And the third estate, the biggest of all, makes up about 97% of the population. They do own a little bit over 60% of the land, but they pay about 50% of taxes. So the majority of taxes are coming out of their pockets. During the late 18th century, France has a time period of weak central power. King Louis XVI came to power by hereditary rules. He had no interest in being king. He had no interest in government affairs. He was really incapable of making any decisions, and he was heavily influenced by his wife Marie Antoinette, who was not a popular figure in France. The Estates General, which is the National Assembly, what we call Parliament in England, or we call Congress in the United States, it's called the Estates General in France. And in the Estates General, each of the estates is represented by elected representatives. However, the majority of the decisions are made by the first and second estate, so the third estate doesn't really get a voice in this government. The Enlightenment was very influential in the French Revolution, like it was in the American Revolution, because it was very appealing to the middle class of France. The ideas of liberty, democracy, justice, equality all enticed the middle class of France, the bourgeoisie. And then there's the American Revolution. So the American Revolution contributed to the high debt that France had, but it also inspired the people of France because it introduced them to these revolutionary ideas. The Americans had successfully overthrown a tyrant by taking up arms against him. They also installed a republic, which is an experimental but proved to be successful form of government, which the French saw as superior to having a monarchy. And they were especially intrigued by the idea that you should not be taxed without being represented in your government. So all of these ideas are going to infiltrate France and inspire the population to rebel. And then the food shortage that hit France made things even worse. There's multiple crop failures that lead to a high price for bread, meaning people can't afford to pay for food, and famine hits, and lots of people are dying or becoming ill from the famine. Paris in particular is the biggest city in France, and it's overcrowded with a lot of people who are hungry, who are desperate, who are out of work, and who are pretty much dying from starvation. Alright, so those are the causes that led to the French Revolution. Let's look at the events that transpired. So the French Revolution, we could say, starts with a meeting in May of 1789 of the Estates General. So the Estates General was called to meet to talk about tax reform. The Third Estate was ignored, and they declared themselves the National Assembly of France. The king dismissed them, and they decided to move to this nearby tennis court where they held these very moving, powerful speeches calling for change, and they vowed that they would not stop until France had a new constitution. So on July of 1789, revolutionaries realized that if they were going to have a chance to fight against the king, they needed some weapons. So they broke into a prison in Paris called the Bastille, and they took weapons. They also released political prisoners, including one of the Enlightenment thinkers, Voltaire. This event marks the beginning of the French Revolution. Shortly after that, in August of 1789, the National Assembly drafted and adopted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. This document proclaimed that the government rested on the consent of the people and not divine right, and it announced that all Frenchmen were free and equal. This document is a lot like the Bill of Rights of England and of the United States. In October of 1789, women played a major role in the revolution when they marched to Versailles to demand bread from the king and the queen. The queen agreed to let them have all the bread in the castle, but that wasn't enough. They demanded that the royal family come back to Paris with them and see what conditions were like in the city. So they dragged them back, put them under house arrest, and that was the last time that the king and queen and their family would ever see the Palace of Versailles. On January of 1793, King Louis XVI was tried and executed for treason. He had conspired against the revolutionaries to stop the revolution and take control of his country, and for that reason, he was put on trial, found guilty, and beheaded. This execution was met with great celebration throughout France because he was very unpopular. As a reaction to this, European countries, the monarchs of Europe, started sending troops into France to fight against the revolutionaries, worried that this revolution bug might take hold in their countries as well. The French Revolution was much more deadly than the American Revolution because of this contraption, the guillotine. So the guillotine had the nickname the National Razor during the French Revolution. This is a machine that has a very heavy blade that's used for beheading people. It was developed to make executions more humane rather than doing it with an axe. This made the execution quicker. But it also made it much easier for French revolutionaries to kill a lot of people during the French Revolution. About 40,000 people were executed using the guillotine during the conflict. King Louis XVI was among the first victims of it. Marie Antoinette will also be executed, and even one of the leaders of the revolution, Robespierre, will become a victim of it as well. So, the Reign of Terror, which began in 1793, was what resulted in all of these deaths, because anyone who was suspected of treason would be guillotined even without trial. They would cut their heads off and they would display them on pikes to spread terror throughout the country, and much of the nobility of France had to flee. If not, they would be caught and killed. 2,400 people in Paris were killed alone. In France, over 30,000 overall. Marie Antoinette was also put on trial and executed on October 17, 1993. And this is because she was hated by the French revolutionaries. She was also found guilty of treason and sentenced to death. And lastly, the French Revolution took a drastic turn. Robespierre was one of the leaders of the French Revolution and the Reign of Terror. He was overthrown by his own people, and then he was guillotined without trial as well. After that, France was ruled by 5 leaders, known as the Directory. So they were trying to share power. However, there was still a lot of economic instability, a lot of political instability in France, and the government was vulnerable to a takeover. So, Napoleon Bonaparte comes to power in November of 1799. He is a brilliant general, a national hero in France. He comes with his military into France and overthrows the Directory, sends the 5 guys packing, and then he establishes a dictatorship in France. And we'll talk more about the changes that he installed in France during his 15 years of power. That pretty much brings us to the end of the lecture. In class, I will show you this slideshow about why Belle should have chosen Gaston, and we'll have a little fun with that. The last thing that you need to do is work on your Venn diagram activity. Fill in the causes and effects as they pertain to either the French Revolution, the American Revolution, or both. And so if you have any questions, bring them to class, and thank you for watching.